Welcome to this week's edition of Journalists Roundtable. I'm Francine Schertzer. Our guests today are John Delano, Money and Politics editor with KDKA-TV in Pittsburgh, Linda Stein, news editor with the Delaware Valley Journal, and Kristen Smith, Pennsylvania's editor for the Center Square. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to start out by talking about an article from Spotlight PA that was released yesterday. They noted that Democrats are approaching this election with the smallest voter advantage in decades. What does that mean? Kristen, would you like to start?
That means, conventionally speaking, that the long-held advantage that Democrats have experienced, that's certainly taking away from what many would consider their safety net when it comes to votes. And then it seems to suggest that Republicans have really upped their ground game and their efforts to register voters. That is something that is interesting in light of the changes that we've had in mail-in voting over the last 4 years. Republicans are historically reticent of it. I should say Republican voters are historically reticent of it, given the tensions of the last 4 years and the claims of election interference. So it seems that report would seem to suggest that those dynamics are shifting. Of course, we won't really know till election day how many Republicans voted by mail versus Democrats. I'm certain that Democrats will still lead in that regard, but the vanishing advantage there it's an interesting turn of events.
John, what do you suspect?
Another thing that article said that I thought was interesting was that a lot of the change in the Democrats is because people either moved out of the state or they died. So that was just cleaning up the voter rolls too.
Well, let me offer a Western Pennsylvania perspective, where we've had tens of thousands of registered Democrats voting Republican for years. So I think there's an alternative suggestion that some of these now Republicans, these are old Democrats who have finally registered with the party that they've identified with for decades. And, I don't have to tell anybody that Pennsylvania, despite the fact that we've had 1 million more Democrats than Republicans, has always had very close elections, regardless. So I'm not sure what party registration means anymore. I will say one thing that I've noted is the increase in the number of independents in Pennsylvania. We're now well over 1 million, easily the difference between the R's and the D's. And the candidate who attracts the independents is the candidate who's going to win statewide.
Do we have any indication of how the independents will vote in this election?
No, at least not from my perspective. I mean, I think that independents, some of the polling suggests that they're leaning to Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. But again, I'm a very big skeptic of polls, which are only snapshots in time. They are never predictors of what's going to happen on election day. But I do think that's a salient group. It's an important group, independents. And, the fact that we see candidates traipsing from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia and all parts in between clearly indicates that candidates know, that this is an election that's going to really come down to the margins. And independents, frankly, Republicans and Democrats, everybody is going to play a role in this.
The latest Franklin and Marshall. Go ahead, Linda, please.
One thing that is sort of interesting that I had just written about is they're courting a so-called Polish American vote in the Philadelphia area. But then there's other reports, like in Politico had an article about it that said there's really no such thing as a Polish American vote. There may have been at one time, but people have intermarried, et cetera, et cetera. And so, it's like a phantom that they're seeking.
Since you brought that up, Linda, you had written a story about President Trump making an appearance at a Polish American church in Doylestown this coming weekend. What does he gain by making that appearance?
I'm sorry, what is it?
What does he gain by making that appearance? You had made a point of noting that it's not a political event or a rally.
Well, yeah, but even though it's not a political event or a rally, the news media has reported that he's going to be there. So most people know that, and they see it as support for Polish Americans, I'm pretty sure. Plus, the president of Poland is coming, and he and Trump are evidently friendly, and I'm sure they'll have some conversations along the side.
This is in response, I think, in part to the fact that Kamala Harris, during the debate in Philadelphia, made reference to the fact that Pennsylvania has 800,000 Polish Americans and that they do not support Donald Trump's position on Ukraine, because the general belief, and certainly the Polish belief, is that once Vladimir Putin takes over Ukraine, Poland is next. And she was trying to use that as a wedge issue in that debate. And I think Trump's appearance in Bucks County at this particular memorial, I guess it's a monument of some sort. Linda, you know more about it than I, but my impression was this was sort of the Trump response to the argument that was made during the debate by Kamala Harris.
Right, a memorial for the solidarity movement.
Yeah.
You and I are old enough to remember that.
Oh, we do. We do. Lech Walesa.
The latest Franklin and Marshall poll was released earlier this morning. It has Harris over Trump 49 to 46%, and in the U.S. Senate race, Casey is polling over Dave McCormick 48 to 40%. Do you see much evidence or anticipate much ticket splitting in this coming election?
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that, because I've thought about that over my 30 years of covering these elections. There used to be incredible ticket splitting in Pennsylvania, where you voted for the Democrat for president, the Republican for Senate, or vice versa. It's part of the reason why Republican Arlen Specter survived for 30 years as a U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania. Ticket splitting. And he wasn't the first. Joe Clark. I mean, I can mention lots of names from the past that most folks won't remember. But the bottom line is that we used to ticket split all the time. My impression in the recent decade is that we do far less of that. That people, even though now we cannot vote straight party in Pennsylvania, they've taken away that option. You have to vote line by line by line. But I still think nowadays people tend to be voting with their party or party line voting when they've made a decision. So I don't anticipate, I mean, we could see what happens. I mean, you can point to other elections where, for example, Biden won, but the two Republicans, Tim DeFore and Stacey Garrity, won two of the statewide row offices. And the same with Josh Shapiro winning when Donald Trump won Pennsylvania. So it happens. I just don't think it's quite as big as it used to be.
What's interesting about the polls too, and Casey has been up over McCormick comfortably this, the entire campaign, but the trend, a wise person once told me to look at the trends and not so much the individual polls, and the trend is narrowing there for him. So it seems to suggest that while, to John's point that, yeah, ticket splitting is something that happens regularly in Pennsylvania. I don't think it's as impactful as it once was. And I don't think that I don't know that McCormick is going to struggle being down ballot from Trump in the way that other candidates might have in past years.
Yeah, an 8-point advantage, that's what the polling is showing, just doesn't happen in Pennsylvania on election day. You win by 8 points, those are Josh Shapiro style landslide numbers. That's not going to happen in this U.S. Senate race. It's going to be 4 points, 3 points. Or
And when you
Oh, there's a
I say I'm very-
Washington.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
There's a Washington Post poll out that has McCormick and Casey tied 48-48, and then an Emerson poll also just came out 48. Oh wait, I'm sorry. That one is a Trump one. Never mind. Looking at my notes.
Well,
I was going to say my favorite way to kind of track polls, because again, I like to look for trends, is to look at the Real Clear Politics. They do a polling average, and you can look at the last 10 to 15 polls, and the ones that have come out post debate, which I think is what really everyone's interested in these days, show that Harris particularly experienced a couple point bump after the debate, as everyone expected. But the most recent polls that came out within the last 24 hours show that bump isn't really there anymore. Overall, the RCP average has them tied with Harris up like 0.7% points. So the polls here, the Harris and Trump have been very close. When you look back, maybe back to 2020 and 2016, the leads between Trump and Clinton and Biden and Trump, they were much more comfortable. Biden and Clinton always enjoyed much larger leads, certainly beyond the percentage of error. That's not happening this time. Now, McCormick and Casey, McCormick is still definitely trailing and has been the whole time. But again, that lead is narrowing. He's been tied in polls over the last couple of weeks. So I haven't checked the most recent ones, but I know that gap is shrinking and it's noticeable.
I would ask my colleagues, Linda and Kristen, whether they buy the argument that pollsters underpoll the support for Donald Trump. This has classically been the case in a number of states, including Pennsylvania, where the polls will suggest going into election day that that Trump is not performing as well as he ultimately does, suggesting that people are not honest when they say that whether they're voting for Trump or not. They tend to not tell pollsters that they're voting for Trump when in the end they do.
That
Is
could
it
be.
going on? What do you think?
So I certainly would believe that was the case in 2016. I think we saw that. 2020, even so. I don't know in this particular environment if that's as much of a factor as it used to be. My other considerations is how are they reaching these voters? Are they calling them on a landline? Are they calling them on a cell phone? How many of these voters? My sense is that people who tend to be, and I'm speaking in great generalities here, but those who identify as conservative or even libertarian or right of center are a lot more hesitant to speak to pollsters, or a lot more hesitant to even respond to this. So are they being undersampled? Potentially. I think but that's not necessarily something that's new. It's just the Trump effect of how much more distrust do those voters have now than they did before. I think you could argue that that's just growing and growing and growing, particularly given what's happened in this current election cycle and just how intense the politics have been over the last 2 months.
Well, there's also the two now assassination attempts on Trump, which I think maybe some people are more sympathetic to him. Maybe they're giving him another look. I'm not sure about that, but that's my impression, possibly.
I mean, my bottom line is that I think they are underpolling Trump support. And therefore, if Harris is ahead by 1 point, that could well mean that Trump's ahead by 3. I mean, you just don't know. And I think for the Democrats, they have to, their polling has to be better than it is now to suggest that they're winning the state of Pennsylvania. This is a jump ball state right now, as far as I'm concerned.
Kristen,
I think
since
it's
you had
fair to
referenced
argue.
the debate just a moment ago. Do you think that voters in general are going to make their determinations based on things like perceived performance or articulation, personality, trustworthiness, or are they going to base their decisions based on policy decisions and policy, how these candidates would handle particular issues?
Policy schmolicy. I mean, I think obviously there's a cohort of people on both sides who are supporting one candidate or another because they embrace the positions of that party or that policy. That's probably the vast majority of people who support Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. But in the middle, it seems to me that in the end, I should say, it seems to me that it does go back to personality, to style, to is this somebody you're comfortable with? Do you want to see this person in the White House for 4 years? Do you want to hear and see what they do? Which is why we get these arguments over Donald Trump is going to be chaos and the like, because you're trying to create really a personality debate over who should be in office. Kamala Harris, she flip-flops, you can't know where she stands on anything, that kind of stuff. So I think these go back not to what policies are, that drives some voters, but I think that when you're down to the real margin of 1%, 2%, 3%, I think there it comes down to whether or not somebody thinks this individual has the temperament, the personality, the style that you like, that you prefer. And, you know, there's plenty of folks out here in Western PA, at least, who love the tough guy image of Donald Trump. And there are others who recoil at the way Trump acts and the words he says. So, and that has nothing to do with policy. It has everything to do with image.
Well, and I would say that too, again, the Trump effect of all of this makes those points even more salient. When it comes to the debate, I'm not somebody who is a huge sports fan, but this is what it always reminds me of is the majority of people who are watching the debate already know who they want. And so they're kind of just there to root their guy on or woman in this case. And so they're going to see what they want to see. They're going to take away from it what they want to take away from it. And if you're someone who loves Trump and is already for him, you were not changed by this debate, even though he came across, I think, arguably less prepared and less polished than, say, Harris did. However, if you don't like Harris and you support Trump, you're going to you're going to argue that, well, she had a chance. She rehearsed. She was fake. She wasn't honest. So those two very much point to who they are, at least who they present to be as people. That being said, everyone's eyes are on the independents and what do they think and where do they stand as far as what's going to sway their vote. I think that there's arguments to be made there. Are people who are registered independent, are they more concerned about policy and that's why they don't identify with either party? Or are they more concerned about the way either party presents themselves and that's why they can't identify? I think therein lies the rub. And again, Pennsylvania is a very interesting place for that because as we discussed earlier, our share of independents is growing and which way they fall in November is going to have a massive difference on who wins the state.
Well, no matter what party you belong to, whether you're an independent or a Republican or Democrat, you're affected by the economy. And the polls seem to show that Trump is ahead on that particular issue, while Harris is ahead on things like abortion.
During the debate in particular, the issue of immigration came up. You've probably all seen all of the memes at this point. Donald Trump had made assertions about the immigrant population and eating pets and things like that. Do you think that this issue carries any weight in Pennsylvania, being that our agriculture community is so big? Agriculture is the #1 industry in Pennsylvania, and we're so reliant on immigrant work.
I'd have to reflect back on what Linda just said. It's the economy. It's what people are paying. And, our other social issues, mainly abortion. I think that those are the two. When you listen to the rhetoric that's out there, that's where all of the discussion is mostly on the economy. So aside, at least from my perspective, from my corner of the news world, his comments about, eating pets, it has not risen above the level of a funny meme at this point.
Yeah, I don't know that immigration is such a big issue, certainly not in Western Pennsylvania, where we don't have the number of immigrants or migrants, for that matter, in this region. I think Philadelphia may be more of an issue than here, if it's an issue at all. Of course, we're only 30 miles from Ohio, so that cats and dogs stuff has gotten a lot of attention. And Springfield, I've been to Springfield. It's not that far away. It's just on the other side of Columbus, Ohio, right off I-70. That's 20 miles from my home. So, I think that the interest in that story and knowing that our neighboring Senator J.D. Vance has admitted it's a fake story, but he won't apologize for it. I mean, there's all kinds of different contexts for this, but Kristen's right. It's primarily meme at this point, and it's been it would be pretty funny if it didn't have such sad consequences for the people of Springfield. The cancellation of their fall festival, I mean, and the bomb threats at schools and in the municipal building. I mean, this is disgusting stuff, and it really ought not to have happened. And that gets tied into the discussion of immigration. But does the southern border travails, does that affect us here in Western Pennsylvania or Pennsylvania as a whole? Probably not.
I think that's an interesting point you make, John, because Dave McCormick, the centerpiece of his campaign really is that immigration, national security, and the economy are intricately linked. And that's why, his plan to help improve Pennsylvania focuses on those things. So it is interesting that you mentioned that because that's really where his rhetoric has been, is reforming immigration and how that's best for Pennsylvania and the nation as a whole. So it is, we'll see where that lands with voters, but that might also explain whereas Casey is setting up the economy's problem is based on corporate greed and he's not looking at other, Biden policies or anything like that. He's saying this is corporations. It's their fault that we have such high prices. So two different style or approaches to solving the same issue, as it were. And we'll see which one lands better with voters.
And we have had some meetings at the Delaware County Council where numerous residents have come in and complained about immigrants taking housing, and immigrants swimming in a creek, supposedly to bathe in naked. So residents in the Philadelphia area, some of them are concerned about it. How now the county claims that they're not a sanctuary county, so it didn't sound like they were going to do anything for those residents' concerns, but it does crop up.
Are these true stories?
The residents insist that they are true. The municipality and the county, not so much.
Yeah, well, that sounds like another Springfield again. We'll wait and see whether President Trump says this. Very interesting.
If we could just shift gears a bit, the state Supreme Court ruled last week that undated mail-in ballots should not count. Kristen, you'd written about this. Could you talk a little bit about what happens, what the implication is if the court doesn't reverse this decision?
It's a fair question because it was a part of the original Mail-in Voting Act law. It obviously was not, there was a lot of different Mail-in Voting Act provisions that weren't followed in the exact same way in all 67 counties, not because of malfeasance or county election officials trying to skirt the law, but just confusion about what they should and should not do. And so there were lawsuits filed in the last 4 years. This was one of them, to kind of sort out those questions. So the Supreme Court in this particular case said that they're upholding the law, that, if it's misstated or unsigned, we can't count it. But they didn't reaffirm the law based on the merits of the complaint. They said that, well, this lawsuit was only filed against 2 of 67 counties. And so until you bring it against all 67 counties, we're not going to get involved. So the law as is stands. So that stands to reason that the complainants could file it again, and it could get back to the Supreme Court and they'll make a more meritoriously based decision. But for now, they are to follow the law as instructed.
And
that's unlikely.
And I was going to say another part of the problem is that we're also dealing with a federal law that really says you can't have ridiculous little rules that that disenfranchise voters. And the whole question of whether or not dating a ballot accurately, when the ballot was received on time and it was executed correctly and there's nothing wrong with the ballot, should that voter be disenfranchised because they wrote, September 10th instead of October 10th or whatever it might be on their ballot? And the federal courts will make a decision on that and have made decisions on that thus far. And part of the reason is this is a federal election. Yes, we're electing a state attorney general, a state treasurer, a state auditor general, general assembly, and all the rest. But we're also electing a president of the United States. And the states cannot independently override the federal law on this. So there's a lot of confusion out here. And one of the real problems, in my view, and I've done stories on this, is the fact that we have 67 counties and 67 different interpretations of what the rule should be. So in Allegheny County, for example, they will alert you if you send in a mail-in ballot that is improperly filled out. They'll let you know so you can correct it. Other counties don't want to do that. And there was a court case in Washington County just south of us in which the county officials said, no, we're not going to let you know. You do it right. You don't, it's not, your vote won't count. And the court in that county, at least, ordered them to tell their voters. But that was just a county decision, and there are other counties that do things differently. I think it's totally absurd, if I can editorialize here, to have 67 different rules when we should have one rule with respect to how you vote across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Linda, you'd written about the 3 women in red, 3 Republicans that are running for state legislative seats. Can you talk a little bit about who they are and if they're gaining more traction because they're running together as a team?
Well, they're hoping that that they could gain traction by having that logo. but I'm not really sure if they are, given the voter registration trends in Chester County, which is one of the wealthiest counties in the country, in the state, and trending Democratic. Two of them are Hispanic, which I thought was kind of interesting. But they all have a varied experience. One of them mostly in nonprofits, the other two in business. But it was just an interesting thing that they would decide to brand themselves as women in red, basically from how the elections have been reported in the last few years of Republicans as red and Democrats as blue.
With so much attention on the presidential race, how engaged are communities in their state legislative races?
I think those are kind of falling by the wayside, and I would imagine that people will vote party on those.
We have 2 state Senate seats that are really being battled on television. So you get the visibility when you're up on TV, and then you put out your mailings and your door-to-door, your grassroots, and all the rest. And we have a state senator, Jim Brewster, who's retired. It is a Democratic district, but the Republican Jen Dentini is challenging State Rep Nick Piscatano, the Democrat, and it's a very heavily spent race. The other district in our area, the 37th Senatorial, these are 2 districts wholly within Allegheny County. The 37th Senatorial has incumbent State Senator Devlin Robinson, who is pro-life, and he's being challenged by Nicole Rosito, the Democrat, who's so far the only issue she's raised is reproductive rights, reproductive freedom, and that's been the nature of her campaign ads on TV as well as her brochures. So, I mean, this will be sort of an interesting test. Most people think the one seat will stay Democratic and the other will stay Republican, but we'll see.
Does anyone see the possibility that the legislature, either the state house or Senate, will switch control in November?
Well, I think the state house has the possibility because it's only a 1-vote margin.
Right.
And if Trump were to sweep the state and have some down ballot effect, that could pick up the 1 seat. I think it's very unlikely, despite what Democrats love to tell me, I think it's very unlikely they're going to pick up the state Senate.
Oh yeah, it would have to be very unexpected for that to happen. There's the Republican majority in the Senate is far too comfortable for them to lose 6 to 8 seats. I think that's what it would have to be, somewhere in that neighborhood.
That will have to be the last word. Our guests have been Kristen Smith, Pennsylvania editor for the Center Square, John Delano, Money and Politics editor for KDKA-TV in Pittsburgh, and Linda Stein, news editor for the Delaware Valley Journal. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.